Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Let's get started with the latest news on Russia's war on Ukraine as it enters its fourth week with Missy Ryan, national security reporter for the Washington Post. Missy, welcome to First Look.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So in his virtual address to Congress this week, Ukrainian President Zelensky implored President Biden to be, quote, a world leader of peace. How was that address received with the administration?
As you say, it was this really emotional, powerful address, and we saw how it affected members of Congress. Not only did Zelensky get a standing ovation, but you saw really this emotional response on the faces of some of the lawmakers there. And I think it really resulted in a strengthening of the calls in Congress for the Biden administration to do more to help the government of Ukraine as it faces off against this Russian invasion. Shortly after Zelensky's speech, President Biden delivered his own address where he announced a slew of new weaponry that the United States is sending to Ukraine to help it fend off the Russian attack. But notably, he did not agree to President Zelensky's plea, which he had repeated in his remarks to Congress, to establish a NATO no-fly zone over Ukraine. And that really reflects this delicate balance that the Biden administration, along with its allies in NATO, are trying to strike as they increase assistance to Ukraine. They recognize the stakes of this conflict, not just for Ukraine, but for all of Europe and the Western security architecture that has governed NATO, the transatlantic alliance for decades. They want to help Ukraine, but at the same time, they really want to make sure that this doesn't escalate into something wider. It doesn't draw in NATO into a direct conflict with Russia, which could be catastrophic.
Right. Can we just talk just a little bit more about the no-fly zone? Because it's not as simple as throwing up a curtain or a dome over Ukraine and preventing Russian jets from flying over the airspace. It would require NATO, for that no-fly zone to actually work and help Ukraine, it would require NATO forces to bomb Russian artillery and military targets inside Russia, right?
Most likely it would. And, we have to remember, thinking about a no-fly zone, Russia has incredibly sophisticated anti-air defenses, and they certainly would employ them in that kind of scenario. So yes, what NATO jets would have to do, first of all, is disable Russian air defenses within Ukraine and probably in the Black Sea and in Belarus and in Russia itself. And obviously, that quickly would escalate into a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. And the Biden administration, not just for its own reasons of wanting to focus on the domestic economy and COVID and all its priorities at home, but really, that is a scenario that is kind of a nightmare scenario. It's hard to even accept that in the 21st century we're even talking about this seriously, but here we are.
Right, and that's why the president keeps saying that would trigger World War III. You mentioned that the president gave his own speech and he announced an $800 million aid package for Ukraine. He also said in that speech that the package would answer Zelensky's call for more weapons, but added, quote, more will be coming. Do you have any idea what is more exactly?
Well, I expect that they'll continue to give some of the things that they've been supplying, Stingers, which is something that only recently the United States started directly supplying to Ukraine, more javelins, obviously lesser weaponry. But I think that in terms of substantively different weaponry, what we can expect is the United States to try to facilitate the supply of anti-air defenses, particularly the SA-300 is a Soviet-era system that Ukraine does have. But Russia has disabled some of its systems in the 3 weeks of this war so far. So what Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said this week was that it was in conversations with the European countries to potentially help supply some of their SA-300 systems to Ukraine. And presumably in this kind of scenario, the United States would backfill those NATO countries by, for example, supplying them with Patriot systems, and so that would allow Ukraine to have systems that their personnel know how to operate, that are compatible with the rest of their military, and help them fend off these Russian attacks from the air.
Mhm. So There are ongoing diplomatic efforts to arrange a ceasefire, but Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov seems to be playing good cop to Russian President Putin's bad cop, who this week railed against quote unquote traitors and quote scum disloyal to him. Does the administration really believe that the Russians are negotiating in good faith, or does the administration believe that they are buying time for a future assault on Kiev?
Officials that I've talked to believe that Russia is certainly entertaining the possibility of a negotiated settlement, if only because the military operation is not going to plan. They have not been able to seize major cities in the way that they would have desired, and Ukrainian forces are not laying down their arms and switching sides to Russia, as President Putin apparently believes that they would. So, the question, I think, both sides, I think, authentically are open to some sort of negotiated settlement. The question is under what terms. So, is Russia willing to accept a peaceful resolution that would retain Ukrainian sovereignty, that wouldn't require the Ukrainian government to give up half of its country or forswear its sovereign decisions to potentially join the European Union or NATO? I think that's the larger question at this stage. President Zelensky has indicated that he would be open to forswearing the Ukraine joining NATO, which is significant, and that's one of the objectives of Russia in this war. But I think the devil is going to be in the details here.
Right. Can I don't know how much reporting you have on this, but President Biden and President Xi of China are due to speak this morning. How important is this conversation to the whole war that's happening on Ukraine right now?
I think it's a very important conversation, but I don't think there are expectations that it's going to really move the needle in terms of the Chinese position. The Chinese position on Ukraine and on Russia is incredibly important to this whole equation, because China represents a potential lifeline for Russia as it faces these incredibly punishing sanctions, as its economy is now in free fall, and it really is going to need support, commercial support, financial support from China. And the fact that Beijing has really increasingly shown its support for Russia at this time is worrying for the United States, and they're hoping that they could pull President Xi back from going all in with Putin. And so that's the objective that President Biden is going to have in this call. And nobody I've talked to thinks that that President Biden is going to be able to persuade President Xi in the 30 minutes or 60 minutes that they're going to have. But it is a chance for him to make the case of why China doesn't want to become isolated like Russia.
Should we take it as a good sign that this phone call is coming 5 days after Jake Sullivan met with his Chinese counterpart in Rome on Monday? Is it a good sign that the United States and China are talking?
Yeah, absolutely. And the U.S. China relationship is, in a much better shape than the U.S. Russia relationship at this stage. And I think that we've seen troubling signs at the United Nations by China, certainly in their unwillingness to support full condemnation of the war that most of the world has gotten behind. But at the same time, the United States and China are so interdependent in so many different ways economically, and I don't think that it's a sign that each country realizes that it needs to maintain these open channels of conversation, even if it's a difficult moment.
Right, because the one thing that sticks that I always remember about the U.S. China relationship is that China owns a ton of U.S. debt. That's
Absolutely.
always one thing to keep in mind. Missy Ryan, national security reporter for the Washington Post. Thank you for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
We're going to keep this conversation going with the Opinions Roundtable in a moment. Let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post deputy editorial page editor Ruth Marcus and Washington Post columnist George Will. Ruth and George, welcome back to First Look.
Hi, good morning, Jonathan. It's great to see you back in the office.
I'm in the office. It's a little weird getting used to. I'm not at home. And I was always fully dressed, but I'm fully dressed here, just so you know.
That's a relief.
So I want to, before we get to Zelensky and Biden's respective speeches this week, I do want to pick up on the conversation I was just having with Missy about China and get from both of you the significance, how you view the significance of the phone call between President Biden and President Xi. Ruth, you go first.
Well, a phone call does not a sea change make, as Missy was saying. China's role here with Russia is obviously a central question, not just for the U.S., but for the whole alliance and for the world. And China has been so far trying to kind of have it both ways and play both sides off against each other, insisting, as the Chinese ambassador did in an op-ed in the Washington Post this week, that China certainly had no idea that this was coming from Russia. Question how accurate that is, and doesn't want to see the conflagration and invasion continue. But China obviously can play a central role with Russia in terms of its willingness to supply weapons and its willingness to continue to veto resolutions at the Security Council and other things. And so there is a lot of interdependence, as Missy said, and a lot riding on this phone call, even if it's not going to be dispositive to the outcome.
Giorgio, I'd love your thoughts, and also picking up on the question that I asked Missy, and that is, should we view it, even if the phone call doesn't yield any progress, should we take it as a good sign that the United States and China are speaking when it comes to the war on Ukraine?
Yes, well, we all fall back on Churchill's better jaw than war. I assume, however, that Mr. Biden has a general and a quite specific message to deliver. The general message is this: do not assume, President Xi, that the United States does not have sufficient bandwidth in its government and its government mentality to focus both on Europe and China. In other words, our current preoccupation with Europe does not mean that the pivot to Asia is over. Second, and more specifically, from the fact that the United States is carefully avoiding direct military support for Ukraine, it would be a mistake for Xi to assume that that means there'd be a similar reluctance on the part of the United States to give direct military aid should Taiwan be attacked.
Oh, I thought there was more coming, George. Sorry about that. Can you talk more about that relationship between China and Taiwan, and why that message you hope President Biden sends to President Xi is important?
Well, twice now since becoming president, Mr. Biden has said that the United States has a military commitment to defend Taiwan. That is not true. Some of us hope that it is in fact true, but certainly not de jure true. Our policy for decades now has been strategic ambiguity. There are a large number of people saying it's time to abandon strategic ambiguity and adopt the great principle of diplomacy: know your own mind and make sure the other fellow knows it too, so that there won't be any mistake at this point. But quite clearly, it seems to me, ambiguity should give President Xi pause.
So Ruth, let's talk. Go ahead, Ruth. Go ahead.
Jonathan, can I just say one quick thing? I think the ambiguity can go a couple different ways as China looks at the implications of the U.S. and the alliance in Ukraine for its own designs on Taiwan. One is that Xi should be concerned and probably surprised at how resolute and united the U.S. and NATO allies have been in pushing back on Russia and how far they've been willing to go in terms of sanctions. That might not be something that he, and certainly not Putin, anticipated, and that would give him pause in terms of his own efforts with Taiwan. At the same time, while the president could say, as George says, that he shouldn't take a lesson from the assertion that we will not engage in direct conflict in Ukraine, one could take a different lesson from that, which is the strategic ambiguity continues despite what President Biden kind of accidentally said about being willing to militarily intervene, and he could be a little bit emboldened there as well.
All right, Ruth, I'm going to stick with you because I want to now focus on President Zelensky and President Biden. Did President Zelensky's speech, Ruth, make it easier or harder for President Biden to navigate that delicate balance between helping Ukraine and keeping the United States out of a direct military conflict with Russia?
I think that President Zelensky's speech helped him, helped Ukraine, pushed to some extent President Biden to be more forward leaning in terms of providing weaponry. We saw that immediately afterwards. He acknowledged in his speech he's not going to get the no-fly zone of his dreams. He's probably not going to get the MiGs of his dreams. And that would be dangerous. As David Ignatius wrote this morning, a cornered Putin is a dangerous Putin, and we need to be very conscious of that. But it's very clear that President Zelensky is playing this moment, and I don't mean to say that in a kind of condescending or negative way. He is using this moment brilliantly, and his speech, I thought, was really quite powerful.
George, I'm going to pick up on something Ruth just talked about in terms of David Ignatius' column talking about a cornered Putin. And it made me think of the rhetoric we've been hearing coming directly from the president and echoed by the Secretary of State, calling Vladimir Putin flat out, quote, a war criminal. Talk about, what do you think about that? And do you think that pushes Putin further into a corner?
No, I don't think he cares what our international law says about this, but what international law says is rather clear. Count one in the 1945-46 Nuremberg trials of the major Nazi war criminals was planning, initiating, and conducting aggressive war. Now, this is clearly qualifies as aggressive war. I will pass over the mild embarrassment that what we did in Iraq in 2003 might also count as war. The second would be violating the rules of war, understood as not targeting civilians or not showing disregard for the safety of civilians in military operations. How we got away with that after Dresden, Hamburg, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo, I'm not quite sure, because we said during the Second World War that our policy was, for example, in Europe, to dehouse the Germans, that is to knock down their houses and make them inefficient workers in the German war machine. But clearly, there are two questions. Is he guilty of war crimes as they've come to be understood? Obviously. Is it wise to say so? I don't see any reason why not, because it helps hold the nations now glued together by sympathy for Ukraine, and is a matter, I'm sure, of moral indifference to Putin.
Right, and let's just keep going on that, Ruth, because I'm sitting here thinking, what can the United States really do when there's an adversary who couldn't care less about what is said of him, whether he's breaking laws, international laws? What can the United States really do?
Well, Putin, as George says, doesn't really have feelings to hurt. Sticks and stones are not going to break him, neither is being called a war criminal. I do suppose that there is a world in which he may be looking down the road and imagining whether he could someday be hauled before the International Criminal Court, a la Slobodan Milosevic, and tried for war crimes. The President of the United States calling him a war criminal doesn't actually push that likelihood any further. So I don't think there's any downside for the president to call a spade in that sense. But I do think that as Putin's role in Russia becomes slightly more tenuous, and we certainly don't have a good sense right now of how tenuous it is or might become, he could be worrying about the Milosevicization of his role down the road. That's the only way in which I think that the war crimes label could actually have some punch, and that's quite remote at this point.
I want to get to the Supreme Court hearings are going to start on Monday, but I have one more question, and that is, I don't know if either of you has had a chance to view the 9-minute long video that Arnold Schwarzenegger did, where he's speaking directly to the Russian people. If either of you has seen it, I would love to get your reaction to how effective that is, and whether that will work with the Russian people living in a country whose government is trying to shut off their access to accurate, true information.
Well, as President Xi well knows, and President Putin is discovering in the age of the internet and VPNs and a population that's very determined and incentivized to get around firewalls to get access to information, it is very hard to shut off people from news about what's really going on, though you can try your best. I saw some of the Schwarzenegger video, not all 9 minutes, and I think that the more we have people speaking directly to the Russian people and trying to tell them the sad and horrifying truth about what is going on and what their country is doing, the better we all are.
Okay, I'm going to go move on to Supreme Court, because it looks like if George has something to say, he'll say it. So the Supreme Court hearings will start on Monday for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's been nominated by President Biden to fill the seat of Justice Breyer on the Supreme Court. Should we expect smooth sailing to confirmation compared to past nominees, George?
I think so. In the modern times, there have been 6 nominees, beginning with Robert Bork, who had 40 or more votes cast against them. They were Robert Bork, Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, all, of course, by Republican presidents. Something changed after Bork, and that is the kind of refusal to give deference of any sort to presidents in their nominations. My view is Biden got 270 electoral votes. He gets to nominate people. And if he nominates someone of obvious intelligence, demonstrable integrity, real experience, go ahead and confirm the person if they're broadly within the mainstream of American jurisprudential argument on constitutional questions. She clearly is. Furthermore, she will bring to the court something missing, which is experience in the criminal justice system. It seems to me one of the problems in American law today is a vast disparity of power working against defendants in the criminal justice system. I would have everyone go back and read Justice Robert Jackson's address to federal prosecutors about the great power they wield and the potential dangers there. I'm particularly alarmed by the fact that so many, like 90% of cases, wind up being plea bargained because prosecutors overcharge and coercively, effectively nullify the right to a jury trial. So I think, frankly, I think she should be confirmed 100-0. But then I think most of the Republican nominees should have been also, because I think they were all people of experience, integrity, wisdom, and let them go.
And so
we'd be a lot better off. George is no longer a Republican, but we'd be a lot better off if the Senate Republican Conference had 50 George Wills in it.
And remember, the point of what I just read would be the Democrats could share this enthusiasm of yours also, because they're the only ones who've managed to gin up 40 votes against 6 nominees, beginning with Bork.
Well, let's stick with the nominee who's going to have her hearings starting on Monday, and we have a shorter conversation time than usual. So this might be the last question for you, Ruth, to pick up on what George was talking about. How it is good. It will be good to have a justice on the Supreme Court who has experience with the criminal justice system, and yet Senator Hawley, who's a member of the Judiciary Committee, put out a long Twitter thread on Wednesday, writing, quote, "I've noticed an alarming pattern when it comes to Judge Jackson's treatment of sex offenders, especially those preying on children." Now, going back through a nominee's record is fair game. But is that desperate, Ruth?
It is desperate. We all know the outcome here. Judge Jackson is going to become, I think it's the third Justice Jackson, and the Justice Robert Jackson, who George quoted, was a great justice. I think that there's going to be some choppy sailing in the Judiciary Committee, not just from Senator Hawley, but probably from Senator Cruz, Senator Cotton, Senator Lee. What do they all have in common? They all have dreams of presidential candidacies dancing in their heads, and they're going to all go after what George correctly identified as a upside of Judge Jackson's background, which is her experience representing criminal defendants. And they are going to be just really, I think, repulsive in their argument that she wasn't doing precisely what her job was and the Constitution demands by representing criminal defendants.
Ruth Marcus, George Will, we are literally out of time. Thank you, as always, for coming back to First Look.
Thanks.
All right, head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more information about next week's interviews and to register. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.